Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into the English Civil War series from Kings and Generals. If you have not seen my previous reactions to this series, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning. We are on to the rise of Cromwell, the Battle of Marston, Moor in 1644. Many of you have been asking, when's Cromwell come on the scene? Here's where we're going to start to see him. He's really not going to rise to significant leadership until the Second English Civil War. That's the one that eventually leads to the downfall of King Charles I and his eventual execution. The link is in the description to the original content. If you want to check it out without my commentary, I'd recommend that you watch all of these videos before you come back and watch these reactions as we break it down a little further. Later on today, going to be doing a live stream where I'm going to be kind of giving you the recap of my weekend in Gettysburg for the 160th anniversary. We'll play a little GeoGuessr as well, so be watching for that. Make sure your notifications are on. Let's dive into the rise of Cromwell.
In 1603, King James I became the inheritor of both the crowns of England and Scotland, bonding the two historically rival kingdoms in a royal union. However, it was clear that...
So just to once again clear up the difference between a royal union and what they have today is that these are still two separate kingdoms who just happen to have the same king. So it's united under the crown, but if for some reason something would happen, it's possible they end up breaking up again. Let's say Scotland changed their inheritance rules. You could possibly have a different king. They're not a united kingdom. They're just separate kingdoms under one crown.
Unresolved divisions still existed between the unruly neighbours, which would serve as a barrier to peace. Political and religious tension between Charles I's court in London and the Presbyterians of Scotland was one of the primary factors which led to war breaking out in 1642. In 1644, this fact would shift the nature of the ongoing conflict completely. Welcome to our fourth video on the 17th century English Civil Wars, covering the continued duel between Parliament and Royalists, the Scottish Covenanter intervention, and the climactic battle at Marston Moor. By the time October of 1643 came around, the two kingdoms of Charles I had been embroiled in a bitter civil war for well over a year. The grave consequences of this violence slowly began to reveal themselves as the months went on, as atrocities against one's fellow countrymen became even more common on both sides.
It's good to see that they're showing this map the way it is, because it's oversimplistic, I guess you would say, to just say that there are two sides to this. There are multiple sides who at any given point are going to ally themselves with people that are going to help push their side forward. So, and then once you win, now you have to kind of debate amongst yourselves where you go from there.
While the gentlemanly warfare of the early war faded away, as the Earl of Essex and his royalist enemies were locked in the bloody First Battle of Newbury, political dealings between Parliament and the Scottish Covenanter government were reaching a conclusion which would intensify the war to an even greater degree. The parliamentarians needed a strong military ally to win the war, and the Covenanters possessed an army ready to march. In return for a promise to implement the Presbyterian religious system in England, Scotland would help to crush Charles's royalists.
So it's pretty fascinating, right? Yeah, everybody wants something. So the battle lines are not as simple as royalist versus anti-royalist. This isn't Parliament versus the king. This is religious factions, and even within the parliamentarians, you're going to have some people who are going to want to overthrow the king completely, others who just won't reform. There's so many factors here.
Months of back and forth negotiation, the so-called Solemn League and Covenant was finalized on September 25, 1643. Meanwhile, the king was bolstering his forces for the next confrontation, as royalist soldiers, previously tied down in Ireland, began returning home. As 1644 began, the north of England came under decisive royalist control by the efforts of William Cavendish, Earl of Newcastle. This all changed on January 16th, when the Covenanter army, made up of 18,000 foot, 3,000 cavalry, 600 dragoons and 120 cannons, crossed the River Tweed and invaded English territory, entering the war on Parliament's side. It was led by the illustrious veteran of Lutzen, Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven. Leven's advance towards Newcastle was almost unopposed, but Cavendish quickly received word of the invasion and managed to beat the Scots to the city, mainly because Leven had to wait for his heavy cannons to arrive by ship.
That's the tricky part, right? When you have 120 cannon, that can make a big difference on the battlefield, but it also slows you down tremendously, and you've got to have supplies. You've got to have rounds for that big solid metal balls, but yeah.
He finally arrived before the city walls on February 3rd. He found many of the suburbs burned to the ground by Cavendish's defending force, who were now reinforced by 5,000 men. Nevertheless, the Tyneside city was put under siege. However, constant harassment of Scottish supply lines by veteran royalist cavalry and lack of shelter, provoked by the defenders' scorched earth tactics, forced Leven to depart with most of his army on the 22nd.
It's amazing to me how much fighting over the centuries this area in the north of England, kind of between York and Edinburgh in Scotland, has seen, because they're on these borderlands between England and Scotland. And so there's been war constantly, and now even in a civil war, they find themselves in the middle of it. And the same thing's true with the Welsh Marshes, that area that's kind of the border between Wales and England. These border areas tend to see a lot of the combat.
Only 6 regiments of the Covenanter army remained to continue the siege. Unwilling to let his enemy escape unhindered, Cavendish set out in pursuit with most of his own troops. Over the next few weeks, Leven and Cavendish maneuvered around one another, unwilling to engage because of the unfavorable terrain and bad weather. Finally, in late March, Leven engaged and defeated his foe in a close battle near Sunderland, forcing him to flee in the direction of York. By this loss, the northern forces of the king needed help immediately, and their main hope for such assistance rested with Prince Rupert, who set off towards Yorkshire to relieve Cavendish's battered host.
And this is all having to take place over weeks or even months, right? Because it's not like this stuff just happens instantly. It takes time to get messages down to Prince Rupert. Now, understand that we're not talking about massive distances, right? In fact, let's take a look. What's the difference between the distance between Middlesbrough and Shrewsbury, for example? So on a straight line, it's 166 miles. I mean, so I guess in theory, you could probably get a message there within a couple of days and get it back. So we're talking maybe a week's turnaround time to kind of get the ball rolling. So that's not too bad. I mean, because remember, these distances that we're talking about, you know, from one end of England to the other, we're talking about like driving across Pennsylvania. So, yeah, the old adage is that to Americans, 100 years is old, but to people in Europe, 100 miles is far. And, you know, the opposite is true. To Americans, 100 miles isn't that far, and to Europeans, 100 years isn't that old.
In a brilliantly executed campaign, Rupert's meagre army broke a siege at the strategically crucial royalist stronghold of Newark on March 22nd, with the prince almost losing his life in the attempt. Instead of continuing his march, the dashing cavalier withdrew to his base at Shrewsbury to raise more men, but barely had time to relax before terrible news came from the south. A week after Rupert's triumph in Nottinghamshire, William Waller got his revenge for Roundway Down by defeating Hopton's royalist army at the Battle of Cheriton, a defeat which ended any prospect of royalist victory in the south. So now what do you do if you're Rupert? Do I go to help the army in the north? Do I go to help the army in the south? Do I sit tight and wait for more men? What do I do? Fortunes had even begun to sour in Yorkshire, when on April 12th, an army of Sir Thomas Fairfax defeated John Bellacy at the town of Selby, and routed a significant portion of York's intended garrison.
Some people made some comments commenting on Fairfax and his connection to Northern Virginia. It's going to be a descendant of his, grandson, maybe great-grandson. In fact, we can look it up. But that ends up being the only member of the British nobility who lives in America during his time. So let me show you who I'm talking about. So often in American history, when we're talking about Lord Fairfax, this is the guy we're talking about who was a mentor to George Washington. So he is born at Leeds Castle in Kent in 1693, dies in Virginia in 1781. Like I said, at the time that he was kind of really prominent in Northern Virginia, he's the only kind of member of the British peerage who's living in the colonies in America. So if we just kind of go back through his line a little bit, his father's the 5th Lord Fairfax, born in 1657. And he is then the son of, let's take a look here. The 4th Lord Fairfax is going to be what? His father probably, 1631. So we're going back another generation from there to the 3rd Lord Fairfax. And now we're talking about the one who was a parliamentary commander-in-chief during the English Civil War. So, it looks like great-grandfather of the guy that we know from Virginia.
After receiving word of the unfolding disaster, the Earl of Newcastle force-marched his army for the second time in just under a year, hoping to reinforce York's defences before the parliamentarians could get there. Once again he succeeded, despite losing many stragglers and deserters along the way, reaching the northern royalist bastion on April 15th. 3 days later, the Covenanter army closed in on Wetherby and rendezvoused with the parliamentary army of Sir Thomas Fairfax, fresh from its victory at Selby. Together, starting on the 22nd, the Allies put England's great northern city to siege. Charles I knew that if York fell, the north would fall. To deal with the sudden strategic crisis that the war effort now faced, leading royalist commanders assembled at Oxford on April 25th for a council of war.
And speaking of York, if you ever get the chance to visit, it's an amazing city to visit with so much history, and yet it's really cool and very just fun. And it was one of our favorite places when we visited there. You know, you've got the York Minster with all the history there, and right outside of York Minster is the monument to where Constantine is declared to be Emperor of Rome, which is really cool. And of course, there's Viking history there. And you've got Clifford's Tower, which is the remnant of York Castle. It's amazing.
After vigorous debate, Prince Rupert gained the upper hand. It was decided that the remnant of Hopton's defeated army would be absorbed into Charles's central army at Oxford, and this newly bolstered force would stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, Rupert himself would raise several thousand troops and go north to relieve York. With that decided, Rupert arrived back in Shrewsbury on May 6th to begin mustering his own men. On that same day, on the other side of England, the Eastern Association Army under Manchester and Cromwell took Lincoln, freeing them up to start marching to Yorkshire as well. Rupert's march began later in the month, with an attempt to assert royalist authority in Lancashire. He first bypassed the firmly parliamentarian town
of... I just gotta say, just randomly as a football fan, right? All I see when I see these towns I see all the football teams, right? Blackburn Rovers, Bolton Wanderers, you got Manchester City and Manchester United, you got Wigan Athletic, you got Liverpool, you've got Leeds United, Sheffield United, and Sheffield Wednesday. I don't know why I'm thinking like that today.
Manchester, but
Blackpool.
Subsequently seized and ravaged nearby Bolton. After fighting for the town came to an end, no mercy was given, and up to 1,000 soldiers and civilians were slaughtered. This massacre helped bolster parliamentarian propaganda. After all, if the king was relying on such butchery of English people to win this war, was he truly their king? In Bolton, Rupert received a welcome surprise when 5,000 royalist cavalry joined his army from the northeast.
The problem here is that you can win these battles, but if you're winning the battles in such a way that it turns the populace more and more against you, are you really winning anything?
But the Earl of Newcastle's horsemen, who had been prudently sent away before the siege began, as cavalry would be useless in such a situation. As Rupert secured Liverpool and cemented royalist control of Lancashire, the king disregarded the southern defensive strategy and embarked on a military campaign in the region. It was a disaster, leading to the breach of Oxford's defensive ring of garrisons, and forcing Charles to flee to Worcester, with Essex and Waller hot on his heels. At this point, the king, realizing Prince Rupert's advice to only consolidate and defend in the south should not have been ignored, sent a set of ambiguous orders, which essentially left Rupert to make his own mind up. We'll catch up with this theatre in our next episode. Upon receiving the communiqué, the Cavalier General interpreted the unclear command in his own way. He would relieve York, as well as destroy the parliamentarians and their Scottish allies, before victoriously marching south to save the king.
So, on one hand, you understand giving unclear orders or ambiguous orders because in some sense it's good to give your leaders discretion because they know the situation on the ground better than you do. But there are also times when it's important to just give clear and direct instructions. You know, there's a famous example of this in the American Civil War. I just got back from Gettysburg, where people talk about General Lee giving Richard Ewell orders to take Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill if practicable. In other words, use your best judgment. And then people have questioned that for over a century now, that Ewell should have done it and Stonewall Jackson would have done it and all this kind of stuff, instead of Lee just saying attack those hills or don't attack those hills.
After the campaign that was about to happen, he would carry that letter from the king for the rest of his life. Rupert's relief army, now about 14,000 strong, set off to relieve York. News that the prince's army was only a day away caused the allies to hastily lift their siege. They withdrew to proactively meet the royalist army, moving their large combined force onto a ridge near a village 5 miles southwest of York, known as Long Marston. The Knaresborough Road, which Rupert was using to march his army, crossed immediately in front of this ridge, with the River Nid behind it. This rendered the direct route to York almost impossible to navigate for the royalists without having a dangerous enemy army threatening their flank.
So here you have the parliamentarian armies and the army from the Covenanters in Scotland choosing the ground for the engagement, right? They get there first, they park their army in a good spot, and now they're going to force Rupert to fight on ground of their choosing.
Rather than risk such an attack, the wily prince resorted to deception. Just before dawn on July 1st, royalist horsemen were spotted advancing up the Knaresborough Road. To the parliamentarians and Scots, it was apparent that this force of cavalry were Rupert's vanguard, with the obvious implication that his main army was only a short while away.
Makes sense.
Accordingly, they drew up their men in battle formation and waited for the bulk of Rupert's army to arrive. However, the royalist vanguard was just an illusion, luring Leven, Fairfax, and the others into a false sense of security. This is why it's important to have good intelligence, right? To have your own scouts that can go out and report and say, hey, this isn't a vanguard. There's no main body behind it. His main body's somewhere else. Or even have scouts at these other bridges that can tell you, hey, no, this is where the real army is. It did everything that a normal vanguard was expected to do. Charles's illustrious nephew swung the majority of his army north at Knaresborough town, crossed the Ouse at Boroughbridge, and was encamped in Gultree's forest by nightfall. Then his forces advanced even further, scattering a small detachment of enemy dragoons at Nether Poppleton and securing a boat bridge there. Realizing they had been outwitted, and fearing Rupert would be able to cut their supply lines to the south if he gave them the slip again, most of Parliament's combined army began marching south to Tadcaster, while its cavalry remained at Marston Moor, covering the retreat. At about the same time, the Royalist cavalry, which had previously been ordered to leave the city by Newcastle, strode back into York under Lord George Goring and formally relieved the city. In a brilliant manoeuvre, which was arguably one of his greatest in the entire Civil War, Rupert had saved Old Roman Eboracum without firing a shot.
He says Old Roman Eboracum because that's, York has had a lot of names over the years, right? Eboracum for the Romans. Efoich is the name that is used by the Anglo-Saxons. It's Jorvik for the Vikings, and then York ends up the name that we bring down through history.
Obeying what he thought to be the king's command to relieve York, then defeat Parliament's army, and then come south urgently, Prince Rupert almost immediately gathered his own and Newcastle's men. Bolstered by the reluctant York garrison and their even more reluctant commanders, the prince marched to Marston Moor and visibly challenged the enemy to a pitched battle. By early evening on July 2, 1644, two of the Civil War's largest armies so far were lining up against one another across Marston Moor. The battlefield was bounded in the east by Long Marston village and in the west by Tockwith. The 28,000-strong parliamentarian army took position on a high ridge, while Rupert's significantly outnumbered 18,000 royalists were forced to occupy a lower section of the moorland to the north.
So this begs the question, which we know the answer already. He thinks he's obeying the king's command. Why do you give battle in this situation? You're outnumbered significantly. The enemy has had time to sit there and wait on you. Why not try to go link up with the king's forces first?
Their position was fronted by an irregular irrigation ditch, which would function as a useful defensive equalizer. On each of the Roundhead flanks, 3,000 English parliamentarian cavalry and 1,000 Scottish troopers were arrayed in 3 lines of battle, supported by interspersed musketeers on foot. The right wing, closer to Long Marston, was led by Sir Thomas Fairfax, while the left was under the command of Oliver Cromwell, accompanied by his increasingly lethal unit of mounted troops, the Ironsides. Forming the mass of Parliament's army were 20,000 infantry in the centre of the battle line. In the vanguard were units from Lord Ferdinando Fairfax's Army of Yorkshiremen in the centre, Eastern Association Army troops of Manchester's on the left, and a brigade of Scots on the right. Behind them in the second line were more of Manchester's infantry and Leven's Scots, and even more...
I love the fact that we have so much detail about how this battle was laid out. And granted, part of that's going to be due to the fact that these are very educated men who have reasons for wanting to give their side of the story, who are going to tell the details of these battles.
Covenanters were in reserve. The supreme command of the entire army of both kingdoms lay with the Earl of Leven. Down the slope, Prince Rupert's feared royalist cavalry matched their opposite numbers man for man and horse for horse, possessing about 4,000 on both the left and right, under Lords John Byron and George Goring respectively.
So the difference is in infantry.
Each of these divisions were also accompanied by musketeer units. However, the Cavalier army only had 10 to 11,000 foot in the centre. It was drawn up in the Swedish style that Rupert had witnessed firsthand during his service on the continent, and was led by the Earl of Newcastle, Prince Rupert himself, and a number of brigade commanders. After a wait of several hours, the battle finally began at about 7:30 p.m. with an artillery duel on the western side of the field.
You don't see a lot of battles that don't start until evening, 7:30. It doesn't give you a lot of time to accomplish things before nightfall when you can't really fight.
Parliamentarian guns began blasting Byron's cavalry, causing a number of casualties and provoking a response from some royalist cannons which had been placed on an area of high ground just in front. This shelling caused some chaos in Cromwell's own ranks and the death of his own nephew. The Roundhead commander kept his cool, responding by ordering his guns to advance with 2 infantry regiments as backup. Foot regiments of Prince Rupert and Lord Byron marched out to meet them, and a short firefight took place, badly mauling the royalist units and forcing them into retreat. This triumph heralded an all-out parliamentarian infantry running march down the ridge slope as thunder began to crack and lightning flashed from above.
Wow.
In the center, the brigades
what an epic image in your mind as far as a battle, right? Between these two big armies, between these competing visions for the future of the country, while lightning storm is going on, and you've got one of these modern battles with cannon and gunfire. Oh man.
of Lord Fairfax and Crawford made good progress, managing to push over the defensive ditch and even capturing 4 Royalist Drake-class cannons. However, not all was going the parliamentarians' way, for the Scottish infantry under Bailey had a more difficult time breaking through the enemy's ranks, bogged down by the cavalry action taking place next to them. On the battlefield's eastern wing, Sir Thomas Fairfax opened the fighting by charging 400 mounted vanguard under his personal command against a similarly sized unit of Royalist cavalry opposite him. The result was a swift rout of the Cavalier horsemen in the direction of York, followed by Fairfax and his horse. However, this left most of the parliamentary forces without an overall commander.
There we see it again. The thing that has happened over and over again in this conflict is horsemen overrunning a position and then they keep on going instead of staying on the battlefield.
And they quickly became bogged down during the advance. Uneven terrain, bracken, hedges, and constant musketry volleys caused disarray among the leaderless horsemen. And at the moment they were at their most vulnerable, Lord Goring's troopers launched a thunderous charge, driving them from the field of battle. Just like at Edgehill 2 years before, most royalist horsemen broke ranks to chase their defeated enemy, cutting many fleeing soldiers down and plundering.
It's easy to pass judgment on this, but in the heat of battle, when this kind of thing is happening, it's easy to let the emotions get the best of you. Your bloodlust is up. You've been fighting. You kind of have to get in a certain mindset to even be able to do something like that. And so you're not really necessarily thinking clearly or strategically, which is why you need leaders who can do that for you and give you direction.
During the Allies' baggage train beyond the ridge. Though they had won their engagement, Goring's cavalry had also left the battle. As the parliamentarian cavalry on the right was being run off the field by Goring, Oliver Cromwell rode out at the head of his first line of Ironsides and charged headlong at Lord Byron's royalist horse opposite, who countercharged across the moor to meet them. Both sets of horsemen fired their pistol carbines until they were exhausted, before wheeling around, unsheathing their sabres for a second charge.
It's interesting to look at this map and to think about what's happened so far in this war, and to consider that a few years down the road, 5 years or so, you're going to have Cromwell as a de facto monarch in this kingdom. Right now, he's just one more guy leading troops on a battlefield.
In this initial disorderly clash, it was Cromwell's horse who came off better, inflicting some casualties and slowly driving Byron back. The situation became even more serious when Colonel Vermuyden's second line rode forward to join their commander, and for a few moments it seemed as though the Royalists might buckle. However, they didn't break under the pressure, allowing time for their own second line to join the fray and stabilize what was quickly becoming the largest cavalry engagement of the war. Somewhere in the chaotic fray, Oliver Cromwell suffered a blade slash to his neck, but carried on fighting nevertheless amidst his men. Witnessing the seemingly decisive clash which was taking place near Tockwith, Prince Rupert rallied his army's cavalry reserve, in addition to his personal lifeguard, feeding those units into the engagement as well. His hope was to tip the scales in favour of Charles's force by hitting Cromwell's unit in the front and sides. When almost all firearms had been discharged, and the cavalry battle had become a grinding contest of sword against sword, the parliamentarian reserve of 1,000 Scottish troopers under David Leslie came forward and swept into both of Rupert's exposed flanks. Attacked from the front by Cromwell and from the sides by his Scottish allies, the Royalist front line was scythed apart and broken with heavy losses. Witnessing the ensuing massacre, their comrades in the rear broke and ran, with Rupert himself shamefully caught up in the rout.
And now it doesn't matter how well you've been fighting in the center, your flank is gone, you're in trouble.
Unlike Goring's men on the other side of the field, Oliver Cromwell and his capable officers kept full control of their own highly disciplined mounted troops, immediately bringing the pursuit to a stop before it began.
Brilliant. There you go. You need leadership. This is why leadership matters on the battlefield. These men unchecked are just going to follow their emotions, and they're going to let that get the best of them. They're going to pursue a fleeing enemy and not think about, well, what I'm doing by pursuing this fleeing enemy is actually hurting my army's chances of winning this battle. You need leaders for that.
They began to regroup and take stock of the strategic situation. In the centre, Lord Fairfax's initially victorious Foot Brigade was countercharged by Newcastle. Though this wasn't in itself critical, the shock of Newcastle's push also drove the 1st and 2nd line Scottish infantry into retreat, opening a gap in the parliamentarian line. Led by Sir William Blackiston, another small Royalist cavalry reserve nearby took the opportunity and charged into the gulf which the Scots had left, carving through the Allies' vulnerable underbelly and even breaking through their final line. However, indiscipline once again proved fatal, and Blackiston's men too rode off the field to plunder the enemy baggage. The only section of Goring's cavalry to have remained on the field then attacked the infantry units in Parliament's right centre, causing significant damage, and even frightening Leven, Lord Fairfax and Manchester into fleeing the field.
So why did they go and plunder the baggage? Well, a lot of times in these wars, you're not necessarily paying these guys great wages or anything. So the way that they're getting compensated, the way that they are being motivated to fight, is by the loot. It's by the reward after a victory.
The combined army's foot was now in almost total disarray. Sir Thomas Fairfax returned to the field with a few hundred horses at that moment. Riding all the way across to Cromwell's position, he supposedly asked, "Major General, what shall I do?" In response, Fairfax said, "Sir, if you charge, not all is lost." Cromwell's cavalry looped around the rear of the Royalist line, scattering Goring's hastily returned cavalry, and then turned on the Cavalier infantry. This marked the end of the battle. Hundreds of fleeing Royalists were slain, and only Newcastle's so-called lambs, elite troops clad in white woolen uniforms, refused to flee and died to a man.
And this all happened in a couple hours at most, because this battle didn't even start till 7:30. So I'm guessing you're not getting a lot of time here.
After a battle lasting several hours, 4,000 men of the King's army lay strewn across the bloody battlefield of Marston Moor, at the cost of only about 300 parliamentarians. After being routed by Cromwell and the Scots...
That whole battle was only 300 parliamentarian casualties? That's crazy. Wow.
Prince Rupert retreated in shame with his surviving cavalry. He would obsessively keep the king's ambiguous order on his person for the rest of his life, ready to excuse his defeat if challenged. The great Earl of Newcastle, whose talents initially secured northern England for the Royalists, could not handle the embarrassment. He abandoned Charles's cause completely, fleeing first to Scarborough and then across the sea to a self-imposed exile in Hamburg. With this disaster, the parliamentarians gained complete control of the north. Our series on the English Civil War will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Awesome. So there you have it there, and you can see now why Cromwell is going to start to rise to the top, man. He was the daring guy in the battlefield. He exercised discipline, solid leadership. He stayed within the chain of command, and when given an order, he executed it faithfully and turned the tide of the battle. Fascinating. We'll see where it goes from here. We'll be back tomorrow with the next episode. Thanks for watching.